The first time I walked into that ballroom, I kept my eyes down. Not because I was nervous, though I was, and not because I was overwhelmed by the room, though the JW Marriott downtown Houston was something I'd never worked before. I kept my eyes down because I was carrying a tray of champagne flutes and my hands hadn't stopped trembling since I'd parked my car 3 blocks away and told myself I could do this. My name is Aaron Briggs, and 2 months before that night I was an assistant logistics coordinator at a mid-size freight company off Westheimer Road. Then my mother's second surgery hit, and the bills came in faster than I could stack them. So I signed up with a catering temp agency and started picking up weekend shifts. The Meridian Health Foundation Gala in November was the biggest event on my schedule that season. The ballroom smelled like gardenias and old money, crystal chandeliers overhead, tables draped in ivory linen, Houston's finest circulating with the practiced ease of people who'd been doing this for decades. Hospital executives, insurance group directors, city council members, philanthropists whose names were on the sides of buildings. A string quartet played something I recognized but couldn't name. I was stationed in the East Corridor, tasked with keeping the champagne moving and staying invisible. I was good at invisible. Then the double doors at the far end of the room opened, and Meredith Coulson came in. I knew who she was because her photograph was in the program we'd been briefed on during setup. Daughter of Leonard Coulson, CEO of Meridian Health, one of the largest hospital networks in Texas. But the photograph hadn't prepared me for watching the room rearrange itself around her arrival. She was in a wheelchair, a woman in her early 30s, composed and slim in a deep burgundy dress, her dark hair swept up with one strand falling loose across her cheek. Her posture was precise. Her expression was calm in the deliberate way of someone who has practiced calm for so long it no longer requires effort. And the moment she crossed the threshold, something in the immediate radius of her shifted, the way a current in a river bends around an obstacle, not violently, just continuously. Nobody sneered. Nobody pointed. It wasn't that. It was quieter than that, and quieter is always worse. A cluster of hospital administrators who'd been moving vaguely in her direction suddenly became deeply interested in the ice sculpture near the bar. A woman in a cocktail dress who'd been heading toward the appetizer table pivoted, smoothly, like she'd intended to pivot all along, and rejoined a conversation on the opposite side of the room. Space opened up around Meredith and then filled with other people, and she was left at the center of a circle. Nobody was willing to enter. She parked near a high-top table at the edge of the room. Her hands rested in her lap. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't performing engagement with an invisible someone across the room. She was just sitting with the reality of it, the way you sit with something when you've sat with it long enough that fighting it doesn't occur to you anymore. If you believe in the kind of dignity that doesn't ask permission, the kind that holds on even when an entire room has decided to look somewhere else, take a second right now and like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that deserve to be heard. Because some things need to be said out loud. My supervisor that night was a man named Phil Garner. Phil had run catering crews for over 2 decades, and he managed his floor like a Swiss watch. He caught my eye from across the room and gave me the look. Keep moving, don't stop, you are not paid to observe the guests. I made 2 laps of the East Corridor. I refilled 3 glasses nobody had asked me to refill. I watched Meredith Coulson check the watch on her wrist, a small private gesture, and I understood it immediately. She was calculating how long she'd have to stay before she'd fulfilled whatever obligation had brought her here. I set my tray down on the nearest surface, and I walked across the room. The distance was maybe 50 feet, and I was aware of every inch of it. I was wearing a white catering shirt and a clip-on bow tie. I had no social standing in a room full of people who had a great deal of it. I had a shift supervisor who was probably already composing the report that would get me pulled from the agency roster. I was aware of all of that, and I kept walking, because the alternative was going back to my tray and spending the rest of my life knowing I had turned around. I stopped at the high-top table. I said, "Mind if I pull up a chair?" She looked at me, not with suspicion, not with warmth yet, but with something that landed somewhere between them, a quiet, startled recognition, like someone had said a word she'd stopped expecting to hear. She glanced at my bow tie. She looked back at my face. "You work here," she said. "I do," I said, "but my feet are something else right now." The corner of her mouth moved. I watched her decide it was safe to let that become something more. Then it did. She gestured toward the empty stool beside the table and I sat down. We talked for close to 20 minutes, about Houston summers, which she'd grown up in and I still hadn't fully accepted, about why the shrimp at every Houston event of this caliber was always served 2 degrees too cold. She asked what I actually did during the week and I told her the freight logistics, the temp shifts, the reason I'd picked up extra work. I didn't frame it as hardship. It was just the situation, and the situation required a practical response. She listened with the full attention of someone who has learned not to take attention for granted. And somewhere in the middle of me explaining the difference between a bill of lading and a delivery confirmation, I realized she was laughing. Not politely, actually laughing, like something had caught her off guard and she'd let it. I found out later, weeks later, why Meredith Coulson had been absent from the public-facing life of the foundation for the better part of 8 months. 14 months before that gala, she'd been driving home from a late shift at Memorial Hermann when a commercial truck blew a tire on I-10 and went sideways across 3 lanes. 4 cars piled up ahead of her in a matter of seconds. Meredith had been a trauma nurse for 6 years at that point, and her training moved faster than the part of her brain that might have asked what the smart thing to do was. She got out of her car. She reached an overturned SUV with 2 children inside, and she pulled them out, both of them, through a shattered window, while the frame was hot and the smell of fuel was already coming up from underneath. She got them both to the shoulder of the highway, both alive, and then the gas tank found a spark. The explosion knocked her into the guardrail. The resulting spinal injury wasn't what the doctors called complete. She had some sensation, some partial function in her legs, but she didn't walk again. There were 3 weeks of news coverage. Houston nurse saves children in I-10 crash. Morning show appearances. Hospital staff lining the hallways when she returned for outpatient appointments. Cards from strangers. And then the news moved on, the way the news does. And Meredith came home to the work of rebuilding her life in a body that had changed, in a world that had rearranged itself into a shape she hadn't been consulted about. She didn't tell me any of that in the ballroom. That night she laughed about cold shrimp and asked sensible questions about freight logistics. But I noticed that somewhere in our conversation her hands had changed, less contained, less held inward, more simply resting. Across the room I became aware of a tall man with silver hair standing very still near one of the marble columns by the main entrance. Leonard Coulson. I recognized him from the program photograph too. He was watching us with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who has learned to assess situations before reacting to them. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach a little. I thought about Phil Garner and my tray and my name on the agency roster. When the evening wound down and guests began collecting their coats, Meredith said something I've carried with me since. She said, "You sat down like it was the obvious thing to do." I told her it was. She shook her head, not disagreeing but arriving at something from a distance. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "how long it's been since someone did the obvious thing." I went back to Phil Garner. He handed me my tray without a word and sent me to break down the east corridor. I figured I was done with the agency. I drove home and stared at the ceiling for a while. The following Tuesday, a number I didn't recognize called me at 8 in the morning. A woman with a brisk, precise voice told me that Leonard Coulson would like to meet with me at the Meridian Health corporate offices downtown, the Allen Center, 32nd floor, Thursday at 10 a.m. I ironed my one good dress shirt twice. The offices were everything the ballroom hadn't been. Clean lines, filtered air, floor-to-soil and glass looking out over Buffalo Bayou catching the morning light. Leonard Coulson came around his desk to shake my hand, and then he gestured toward 2 chairs near the window, the kind of gesture that doesn't put anyone at a disadvantage. He sat across from me like we were 2 people with something to sort out together. He asked me why I had gone over to his daughter. I told him the truth. I said it seemed like the obvious thing to do, and nobody else was doing it. He sat with that for a moment. Then he told me that Meredith had called him the morning after the gala, the first time she'd called him in several weeks, and that she'd been laughing when she described it. Actually laughing, not the performance of it. He told me she'd agreed to attend another foundation event the following month, that she'd been in therapy twice a week and making real progress, but that something about that evening had moved something the sessions alone hadn't reached. He looked out the window for a moment and then looked back at me. He offered me a position on the Meridian Health Foundation's community outreach team, a real position, with a salary that wasn't a catering shift rate. I waited for the part where he explained it in terms of owing me something. That part didn't come. Instead, he said, "People who act on what's obvious are harder to find than they should be." I said yes. What happened next happened the way real things happen, slowly, with setbacks, and without a clean timeline. I want to be honest about that because the clean version would be a disservice to what it actually cost. Meredith started coming to foundation events. At first, she positioned herself near an exit and left before the main program began. Then she started staying for the full evening. Then she joined team planning calls, and her input was specific and precise, in the way that comes from knowing a world from two angles. She'd spent 6 years as a nurse, and more than a year now as a patient, and she understood the gap between those two experiences better than anyone in any of those meetings. The first time she spoke publicly after the accident was at Texas Children's Hospital, in a rehabilitation unit where kids were recovering from trauma surgeries and burn injuries. She wore a short-sleeved shirt that day. The scars on her forearms, from reaching through the broken car window on I-10, were visible, and she didn't cover them. She showed them to a 12-year-old boy who'd been in the unit for 3 weeks, and she told him that her arms looked like this because they had done something that mattered. She told him the marks don't consult you before they arrive and they don't leave when you ask them to. And eventually, she said this quietly like she was still arriving at it herself, eventually you stop minding them because you know exactly what they mean. I was standing in the doorway of that hospital room and I had to look at the floor for a second. Not because I was sad, because what I felt in that moment was simply too large to hold straight. But things didn't go cleanly. They never do. A local lifestyle blog ran a piece that paired an old photograph of Meredith from before the accident with a recent one, framed in the particular way designed to make the reader feel that something had been lost. Meredith read it one night after a long strategy session, sitting across from me at a conference table, with an empty coffee cup beside her laptop. I watched the old exhaustion come back across her face, unhurried and familiar, like weather she'd learned to recognize. She didn't say anything for a while. She just sat with it. I told her I remembered what she'd looked like near that high-top table at the Marriott, calculating what time she could leave. I asked her when the last time was that she'd done that. She looked up at me. "I know," she said. "I know." "That's not nothing," I said. She closed the laptop. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. In the year that followed, the Meridian Health Foundation expanded its patient advocacy work into 3 counties it hadn't operated in before. Meredith led the development of a mobile outreach program specifically for trauma survivors in rural communities outside Houston. People who'd been through something significant and then driven 2 hours home to sparse resources and no one who understood what they were carrying. It's the kind of program that doesn't exist until someone who needed it and didn't find it decides to build it themselves. She presented the program at a healthcare conference in San Antonio that spring. She was the last speaker of the day, which is the slot where audience attention typically goes to die. When she finished, the applause took a moment to start because the room needed a second to come back to itself. Somewhere in all of it, the hospital corridors and the late budget reviews and the drives back from rural clinics, something grew between Meredith and me that neither of us had sat down to plan. I want to say that carefully, because this isn't only a love story. It's a story about what happens when one person refuses to look away, and what that refusal restores to someone who had been waiting, without quite admitting it, to be seen. The following November, the Meridian Health Foundation returned to the JW Marriott downtown for the annual gala. Same chandeliers, same gardenias, same string quartet starting up as the first guests arrived. I came early to help with setup. Phil Garner's catering crew had the contract again. Phil saw me walk in and gave me a nod, which from Phil is approximately a standing ovation. Meredith arrived during the cocktail hour, no entrance announcement, no staged moment. She came in beside Leonard and went directly into the main room and into a conversation with a pediatric surgery director from Baylor St. Luke's named Dr. Wyckoff. They talked for 30 minutes. I saw Meredith laugh twice. I saw her hand over a business card and watched Dr. Wyckoff accept it and put it in her jacket pocket with the kind of specificity that means she intended to use it. When the dinner program ended and the room loosened, Meredith came over to where I was standing near the east corridor, the same stretch of floor where I'd set down my tray 12 months earlier. She said, "Same ballroom." I said, "Same champagne flutes." "You're not carrying one this time." "I got a promotion." She smiled at that, the way she smiles when something lands true. Then she went quiet, the way she does right before she means something. She told me she'd spent a long time after the accident believing that what happened on I-10 had ended one life and started a smaller, diminished version, that the world had quietly agreed with that assessment by rearranging itself around her, around what she could no longer do, around where she could no longer fit. She said she'd gotten very good at calculating exit times. She said she'd gotten very good at sitting with the obvious fact of it. Then she said, "You pulled up a chair, in front of everyone, like I was just a person at a table who might want some company." I told her I didn't consider that a particularly courageous thing to do. She said, "I know, that's what made it courageous. If this story reached you somewhere real, I want you to like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded they're worth staying for." And before we go, one thing, leave a comment with the word present if you believe that seeing someone completely, not despite everything they've survived but alongside it, is one of the most honest things one person can offer another. Because here's the thing I carry from that night in Houston. Meredith Colson pulled 2 children out of a burning car on an interstate highway in the dark. She did it without hesitating, because it was the obvious thing to do, and there was no one else there to do it. People called that heroism. They're right. But I watched her do something harder than that, over and over, for more than a year. I watched her walk back into rooms that had already written her off. I watched her present her arms, and everything on them, to a room full of strangers and hold still while they adjusted to what they were seeing. I watched her hand a business card to someone who hadn't expected to receive it, and then wait, without apology, for the moment to settle into something real. She told me once that I gave her something back. I've thought about that more than she knows, and I don't think it's right. I think what happened at that high-top table near the east corridor of a Houston ballroom is that I looked at what was already there and didn't turn away from it. That was all. It turned out to be enough. And I will spend the rest of my life learning from the woman who showed me that being fully present for someone, putting down the tray, pulling up the chair, staying in the obvious moment, when everything in the room is leaning the other direction, is not the smallest act of kindness available to you. It is very often the largest one.